So Nigerian professor Nkechy Ezeh bags 70 months in US prison for stealing 1.4 million US dollars meant for poor children. Former West Michigan non-profit CEO sentenced to federal prison after 1.4 million fraud scandal. She once stood before donors, community leaders, and struggling families as a symbol of hope. Now she walks into federal prison branded by a judge as a fraud and a thief. Dr. Nkechy Ezeh, 61 years old, a former non-profit executive from Kent County, Michigan, has been sentenced to 70 months in federal prison after prosecutors uncovered a sweeping fraud scheme that siphoned more than 1.4 million US dollars meant for vulnerable preschool children in West Michigan. What began as a respected career in non-profit leadership ended inside a federal courtroom in Grand Rapids, where Chief Judge U.S. District Judge Hala Jarbou delivered a blistering condemnation of Ezeh's actions. This was brazen and widespread. The judge declared, according to court proceedings, the money she noted was never meant for luxury, personal gain, or hidden accounts. It was intended for some of the region's most vulnerable children, preschoolers from struggling families who depended on educational and developmental support programs funded by taxpayers and charitable donors. But behind the polished image of a non-profit leadership, federal investigators say a different reality was unfolding. According to U.S. Attorney for the Western District of Michigan, announced by U.S. Attorney Timothy Vahe, Ezeh orchestrated a long-running fraud operation that diverted massive amounts of public and donor money away from children and into channels that ultimately benefited her personally. The sentence handed down this week marks the dramatic collapse of a woman who once occupied a position built on public trust. The scheme behind the smile. To the outside world, the non-profit mission appeared noble. Programs designed for preschool children often rely heavily on grants, donor contribution, and government-backed funding intended to provide educational opportunities, developmental support, nutrition assistance, and care services for low-income families. Authorities say Ezeh exploited that trust. Federal prosecutors revealed that over time, approximately 1.4 million US dollars was fraudulently stolen from funds specifically intended to support vulnerable preschool children in West Michigan. Investigators allege that the scheme involved manipulating non-profit resources and abusing executive authorities to redirect money for unauthorized purposes. The fraud shocked many within the community because non-profit organizations are generally viewed as safe havens for charity and social impact. Institutions people trust with both money and hope, but prosecutors painted a far darker picture in court. According to the government, the scheme was not a brief lapse in judgment or a single accounting error. Instead, investigators describe it as deliberate, organized, and calculated. The courtroom had how taxpayer dollars and donor contributions, funds given in good faith by ordinary citizens and organizations hoping to improve children's lives, were allegedly transferred into a personal financial pipeline. As the details emerged, the emotional weight of the case became impossible to ignore. This was not money stolen from faceless corporation. This was money intended for children. A fraud and a thief. When sentencing day arrived, the atmosphere inside the courtroom reportedly carried the heaviness of betrayal. Chief U.S. District Judge Hala Jarbou did not soften her words. She described Ezeh bluntly as a fraud and a thief, condemning both the scale of the scheme and the type of victims affected. The judge emphasized that the stolen funds were meant to uplift some of the West Michigan's most vulnerable preschool children whose families depended on social programs and educational assistance to survive difficult economic realities. In many fraud cases, victims exist only on spreadsheets. Here, the victim had faces: young children, parents struggling to make ends meet, families trusting that non-profit systems were working in their favor. Judge Jarbou reportedly noted that the betrayal cut deeper because it targeted programs created specifically to protect and nurture children during some of the most formative years of their lives. The sentence reflected that seriousness. Ezeh was handed a 70-month federal prison sentence for the fraud scheme. But that was not only the crime addressed in court. The tax evasion charge. Federal authorities also uncovered evidence that Ezeh attempted to evade income taxes connected to illicitly obtained funds. As a result, she received an additional concurrent prison sentence of 60 months for tax evasion. Prosecutors allege that while millions moved through fraudulent channels, income linked to the scheme was deliberately concealed from tax authorities. The IRS ultimately became part of the widening federal investigation. Tax evasion charges often become the final thread that unravels financial crimes, and in this case, investigators say the financial trail exposed not only the misuse of non-profit funds but also attempts to avoid federal tax obligations tied to the stolen money. The court ordered Ezeh to pay approximately $390,174,000 to the Internal Revenue Service. Combined with the restitution linked to the fraud case itself, the financial consequences are staggering. Ordered to repay millions. Beyond prison time, the court moved aggressively to recover stolen funds. Judge Jarbou ordered Ezeh to repay roughly $1.4 million in restitution to victims affected by the fraud scheme. That restitution is intended to compensate organizations and programs that lost critical funding because of the operation. In total, Ezeh now faces repayment obligations nearing $1.8 million when tax liabilities are included. Whether the full amount will ever be recovered remains uncertain. Financial fraud cases often leave institutions and communities scrambling long after sentencing headlines disappear. Programs disrupted by missing funds can take years to stabilize. Children who lose access to the educational resources rarely get those missed opportunities back, and donor trust, once broken, can be difficult to rebuild. Immediate remand to prison. Perhaps one of the most dramatic moments of the sentences came after the ruling itself. Judge Jarbou ordered that Ezeh be remanded directly into federal custody immediately following sentencing. There will be no delayed surrender, no extended period to prepare, no final months outside prison walls. The former non-profit executive was taken into custody to begin serving her sentence immediately. For someone who once moved through professional cycles as a community leader and executive figure, the image marked a stunning fall from grace. The transformation was complete from non-profit CEO to federal inmate. A community left asking questions. The case has sparked intense conversation across West Michigan and beyond. How does someone entrusted with helping vulnerable children gain access to such enormous sums without earlier detection? Could oversight systems have prevented the fraud sooner? And perhaps, most painfully, how many children ultimately suffer because resources meant for them disappeared? Non-profit organizations occupy a unique place in society. Unlike corporations built primarily around profit, non-profits often survive on trust, emotion, and public goodwill. Communities donate because they believe their money will create positive change. When that trust is violated, the damage stresses beyond finances. It damages belief itself. Federal authorities say the case sends a strong warning that abuse of charitable systems will be prosecuted aggressively. Officials emphasize that crimes involving public assistance programs and vulnerable populations are treated with particular seriousness because of the real-world consequences attached to stolen funds. The human cost behind financial crime. Behind every fraud statistics is a chain reaction. A missing educational resource, a delayed program, a classroom left underfunded, a child who needed help but received less because the money was gone. While court documents focus heavily on figures, charges, and sentencing guidelines, the emotional core of the case lies in who was supposed to benefit from the money. Preschool children, some of the youngest and most vulnerable members of the society. At that age, support systems matter enormously. Educational intervention, nutritional assistance, developmental care, and early child programs can shape the trajectory of an entire life. Federal prosecutors argue that Ezeh's actions rob not just organizations but opportunities. And unlike financial spreadsheets, lost childhood opportunities can easily be repaired. From leadership to infamy. For years, Ezeh reportedly operated within circles built around service and advocacy. That makes the downfall all the more dramatic. The same leadership role that once gave her influence within the non-profit sector ultimately became the vehicle prosecutors say she used to orchestrate the fraud. Now, instead of being remembered for non-profit achievements or community development, her name has become attached to one of the region's most disturbing charity fraud cases. The sentencing closes one chapter of the legal battle, but for many in the community, the broader impact will linger. Families affected by disrupted programs, donors questioning future contribution, non-profits forced to reassure communities that their missions remain trustworthy. As a federal prison sentence, serving as a public reminder of what happens when power entrusted for service is allegedly transformed into personal enrichment. In the end, the court's final image may be the one that defines the entire scandal. A former non-profit CEO standing before a federal judge, a judge calling her a fraud and a thief, and millions of dollars meant for vulnerable preschool children at the center of a betrayal that stunned an entire community.